Okay, so first of all, thank you. I want to thank the organizers for inviting us, accepting this paper. I know it was very competitive, so it's great to be here on the social science side. Second, I want to mention my co-author. This is a co-authored paper. My name is Erez Maggor, but my Fabio Balfon and Timur are both on this paper as my collaborators. They're sorry that they couldn't be here. They're both in Europe. They would have liked to have been here, so they send their regards. And the third note I want to make before I start is that this is very much a work in progress. The paper we have is kind of a first draft. We're working through a lot of these ideas. So all that to say is that a lot of these findings I'm going to present are still open-ended. We're still working through them, but also would love your feedback and comments on these. Okay, so I think this talk is very much in dialogue with the previous with the paper, and we're going to talk a lot about conditionality, which we think is, and I'll make the case today, kind of the core principle and idea and the the most crucial aspect of effective industrial policy. And we're trying in this paper not only to kind of dig deeper into what conditionalities are, what they look like, what kind of shape they take, how do we see them, what kind of historically what has worked, but then take another step to look at the political economy of them. So, okay, great, we can design the best effective policies, but what conditions historically have, or what kind of things do we need to get these in place, right, to actually implement them? Okay, so I think the context for the return of industrial policy is pretty well known, especially here. It's driven by environmental, geopolitical, and domestic concerns, which are both economic, right, inequality, but also political, right, the polarization, the rise of right-wing populism. This has kind of been in the context. And this has resulted globally, I mean, in the US, but also in Europe and also elsewhere, in kind of the flow. Here's a quote by Ben-Gurion, kind of hundreds of billions of targeted funding flooding businesses in the military, high-tech, green sectors on both sides of the Atlantic, right? So this is a kind of a big turning point, kind of a return to industrial policy. So in the US, we have what's already mentioned, the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act, the IRA. In Europe, they're working on the Green New Deal, or Green Deal industrial policy. But also we've seen in other places, in South Korea, we've seen Germany 2030, France 2030, kind of all these states are now putting together these kind of industrial policy big packages. So if we look at these this return to industrial policy, I think it's nice to look at both the optimists and the pessimists, right? We have people kind of responding, scholars from around the world that have kind of responded to this. So on the optimist side, we have people like, again, Ben-Gurion or Gary Gersel, a historian, that have seen industrial policy as signifying kind of a new reconfiguration of capitalism and even marking the fall of the neoliberal order, right? So these kind of big statements, we're having a dramatic change in the political economy landscape around the world. But also we've seen the pessimists, kind of the more critical side. I think this is led by Daniel Gabor, but also people like Dylan Riley and Robert Brenner and Thomas Piketty, which have kind of looked at what states have been doing as this is another form of de-risking or upward redistribution, right? So Thomas Piketty has said, tax credit can be looked at another addition of subsidies to private capital, right? So this is maybe the continuation of tax competition in more extreme ways. So we've been lowering taxes on corporations, now we're just giving them money, right? So this could be another extreme continuation of the same pattern that has existed in the neoliberal order. And Daniel Gabor said, what states are doing now is taking all the risk off of corporations, funding their innovation and their R&D, but where are the rewards, right? What are we getting back in return? So we think this is crucial. This brings us back to this question of, are we witnessing industrial policy or are we witnessing corporate welfare, right? And this brings us back to the very, very important work of Alice Amsden, but also people like Vivek Chibber, Robert Wade, and our own work as recently, my paper and Fabio and Timur's work, that have kind of looked at corporate welfare and what distinguishes industrial policy from corporate welfare. And this is where we get to the issue of conditionality, Basically, what we say is if you want to identify industrial policy, what you need to be showing is not only that there is money and public funding that's channeled to corporations, but you need to see that money channeled together with conditionality, with corporate guardrails, to ensure that that money is not just flowing to enrich investors, to stock buybacks, but is actually going in the direction that we want, into productive investment, into job creation, into creating new jobs, into place-based, right? So going into regions that need that investment and not going into other places. And we think that conditionality is crucial, and it affects both the kind of the social distribution of the policies, kind of who is going to be the winners and losers, and also the effectiveness of the interventions, right? So if we're giving money to corporations in order to do chip manufacture, to do innovation, but they take that money and then channel it elsewhere, right? Again, whether it's for corporate buybacks or to enrich their shareholders other ways, then that defeats the purpose of the policy in the first way, right? So we need to make sure that the money is channeled in the right direction, right? So that's kind of leading us into stressing this point again about conditionality. And we think that we identify that kind of in the recent literature on what's called the neo-developmental state, there's been less and less emphasis on conditionality. I think because I mean, this is my reading of it, we can argue it. I think because a lot of the literature was in this, in the context of neoliberalism, it was trying to show, look how much the state is active, look how much the state is doing. But what it's forgot to do is kind of, but it stayed with kind of showing the incentives and the subsidies and not together with these conditionalities, right? So what we think is kind of this idea of within transfer conditionality is kind of crucial for the success of these 21st century return of industrial policy. So that's what we focus here in this paper, and we basically have two questions here. First is, what do we talk about when we talk about conditionality, right? So let's dig deeper into the policy design, focus on different types of conditionalities rather than the goals, right? So what kind of conditionalities have we seen historically? What could work? What can we adopt? And the second thing, like I mentioned earlier, is looking at the politics, right? What are the political and institutional mechanisms that produce these conditionalities, right? So, okay, it's great to have we can figure out what the ideal policy is, but we might not be able to implement it. So what do we need in order to implement it? And this brings us, so what we do in this, oh, sorry. You can't separate them, but what we're trying to emphasize are the specific conditionalities and not the goals that they aim to achieve. I mean, they're both important, right? But what we're trying to see, and you'll see this in the analysis of the results, that we're trying to dig deeper into what types of conditionalities can be used, assuming that the goals are relatively well known. Yeah.
So I think it's a good point, and you're right to focus on industrial policies for which there is a transfer.
Right. Exactly.
But a large class of policies don't entail that. For guidance.
Mm-hmm.
A bunch of different levers don't necessarily require that. How do you think about that in terms of?
Right. So that.
Are you really concerned with policies, industrial policies for which there is?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great question. I need to think more about it. It could be that we're excluding important policies, or they're here and they actually don't require transfers, and we should be more specific about this. So we'll see this in the kind of when I talk about the case studies. But I think the reason we've focused on this is that seems to have been the major tool that's been adopted, right, and used now in comparison to the past. So I think, I mean, we have seen tariffs kind of return, but we haven't seen, I mean, at least if you look at these new Bidenomics, there's less of that, right, and more transfer. So that's why we're kind of, we're looking at where the action is happening at the moment. But you're right, we could maybe broaden a little bit. So as far as the method for this paper, it's kind of a theoretical paper. We're doing something that we're both trying to be narrow and broad. I mean, the narrow focus is looking at the success cases, right? So we're we're shooting where the ducks are. So we've gathered a bunch of historical case studies where states have been effective and succeeded in implementing industrial policies with conditionality. So we can learn from those cases, and in that regard, we're very narrow. In other regards, we're very broad because we are not limiting ourselves to specific industries. We're not limiting ourselves to specific regions. So we're looking both at developing and developed economies. We're looking both at the state level, but also locally. We're looking at anywhere that has succeeded, right? And maybe there's an assumption here that this does not matter for our findings. We can argue about that, but that's what we're trying to do in this analysis. And then, like I said, we're looking, and I'll show you both the policy design and then looking at the political mechanisms. So let's go to some of the findings. So like good sociologists, we have a nice 2x2. It started by a 2x3, but then we figured we can't have that. And basically what we have here is 4 broad categories of conditionality. We have, and I'll present them, right? But we have economic performance, control conditions, knowledge-related conditions, and environmental targets. So let me kind of unpack them and explain what these are. So I think let's start with the first one, economic performance. I think this is the most widely discussed type of conditionality in the literature. So it covers a wide variety of issues, but the common is the fact of we're conditioning assistance based on specific targets, right? The economic performance of the recipients. So it could be either production quotas, it could be investment quotas, it could be employment targets, export quotas, or production standard, right? So the state or whoever is providing the funding sets a target, and that the assistance or additional assistance or future assistance, it conditioned on meeting these targets, right? So the classic example is kind of South Korea, right, in the 70s and 80s, which set very specific export targets, right? So firms had to meet export targets, and firms that met them received new funding, additional funding. Firms that did not meet the targets would either lose funding and then see funding moved to other firms. So this is kind of just one example. The same is, so like, for example, it could be with export targets, but it's also could be, yeah. Yeah, sorry.
Trying to be quick, because there's so much. No, just a question on this, because there's obviously differences across those and how realistic it is to be able to assess them. So export targets, that's an easy one, but say you have one on saving the planet or being more inclusive, that's a hard one to evaluate. And is kind of setting then an emphasis on conditionality, meaning that maybe states will end up kind of fostering something that is too narrow, not really reaching what one would like ideally to reach, and therefore actually doing a bad thing out of what was a good thing in terms of conditionality?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think at this stage we're not. I think for this exercise we don't look in that fine detail, right? As far as distinguishing, do production targets work better than investment targets, and how do you enforce them? We're trying to kind of right now kind of map out what has worked historically. That maybe kind of will require additional work, right? So we haven't gotten to that level yet. Yeah.
Okay. I just had a quick clarification question. Yeah. So I think this might just be because I'm not super familiar with this literature, but so should we interpret what you're talking about in the talk in general in the paper? Because you mentioned you're focusing on kind of success cases of conditionality. Yes. So do you want us to like interpret your findings as like these are the forms of conditionality that have a track record of success, and there are others that you're not covering?
Exactly. All right. We're looking at things that have worked in the past. Exactly. Yeah.
I would just be curious why you didn't pull out employment and labor as a separate category, since it's such a common and rich one. So we could talk about that later, but it just strikes me as buried in the other economic conditions.
Yes, we could. I mean, we could carve out this differently, so I'm open to suggestions there. And we definitely are looking at these kind of things specifically. So I would need to think that's a good point. So let me continue kind of fleshing this out, or yeah, let me take a couple more minutes. Sure. Something specific on this slide?
It relates to these. I think that the question is just, these seem like tools that nations can use pretty effectively. Would you say that, you know, within nation states can use these as well if they're interested in implementing corporate guardrails? And how might it differ from the state perspective?
Right. So again, at this point, it's not detailed enough where we can say like these could be used by both states and localities. We're trying to map out the diversity. Okay, control mechanisms. Corporate control is where the state is providing funding in return for requiring firms to alter their corporate structure in some way. This could be states getting shares in a specific firm, so we could then influence its business behavior. One good example, again, going back to labor, it could be forcing firms to accept collective bargaining, right? So telling them, if you are taking money, this kind of stuff from the government, we want you to negotiate with labor. So that could be one means of corporate control. And various others, right? You can see here, equity transfer, cooperation, right, with other firms, right? So data, knowledge sharing, collaboration, making sure that firms are cooperating with each other. Royalty payments, dividend transfers, things also we saw mentioned earlier as far as sharing, right, gain sharing with the public. And knowledge-related conditions, this is, I think, the reason it's got its own category because it's very relevant to the kind of more recent kind of industrial policy that's focused on innovation, right, in R&D. How do you assist firms become more innovative, usually through R&D subsidies and grants, but on the other hand, get things like we discussed earlier today, where firms are not just innovating, but they're also manufacturing and producing locally. So this has, here we're looking at regulation of intellectual property rights and ownership, and I think classic, very good examples here would be a state like Taiwan, which provided knowledge, created knowledge, and then transferred it to the private sector, or funded knowledge creation through R&D subsidies, but then had very specific conditionalities of firms, what they did with that knowledge, right? They had to scale up locally, they had to commercialize that, and the states had the mechanism, clawback mechanism, so when firms did not do that, they could take ownership back of the intellectual property, shift it to other corporations. Another example would be based on my own research on Israel, also with its innovation policy, where the state provided a lot of R&D subsidies, but there were conditions attached to them. One had to do with local manufacturing, right? So again, scale up from innovation to production, and also limiting the transfer of our intellectual property. So firms could sell intellectual property, but they can't move it out, right? So it's kind of creating this domestic scale up that is locally. So the state might not care about owning the property rights, but it wants to ensure what happens with those technologies later on. And then the first one is on environmental targets. Here, again, I think this is a form of I'm thinking about your question about which kind of assistance, right? So if we look at environmental targets, here firms receive subsidies, but also it could be consumers, right? So we're helping the firms by subsidizing consumer subsidies, their ability to buy, for example, EVs, right, or more fuel-efficient cars. So we're providing, the state is providing subsidies. On the other hand, it's requiring firms to collaborate with regulation, environmental regulation, right? And the classic example here, a good example I think is the kind of auto bailout in the Obama period, where firms received subsidies and also a lot of help from the government, but those subsidies and transfers were conditioned on both firms investing in moving up into more environmental friendly automobiles, but also to not reject regulation, right? Environmental regulations that the government was trying to push forward. So kind of we want your cooperation in return for this assistance. So these are kind of these varieties of conditionality that we're thinking about. And again, like I said, this is very open-ended, so we could very much include new categories, break up categories, merge categories, depending on kind of the feedback that we get. Now, I want to shift into talking about the political economy of these conditionalities. So what we do is, the second exercise is, okay, now we've identified places and historical periods and case studies where we've seen these types of conditionalities. Now, how have the states been able to do this? And here, what we're starting off with is looking at, very basic in political economy. We're looking at institutions, we're looking at ideational factors, and we're looking at coalitional politics. And what's interesting, I'll kind of take you through all three of them, is that some seem to matter more than others. And this is something, again, that still we're working through. But let me start with the institutional. I think institutional, interestingly enough, is where we're finding a lot more heterogeneity and differences, right? So historically, and some work has stressed government structure and authoritarian regimes, right? Going back to South Korea, we can look at China today, but we've seen industrial policy and conditionality work very well also in democratic settings. So it actually, there's we can actually see that very much of a variety there. Another thing is that there's a lot of debate about either do industrial policies work better as a top-down or as a decentralized structure work better, and we've seen examples of both of those as well, right? We've seen kind of South Korea, Taiwan, more of a top-down kind of institutional setting, but we've also seen the US kind of decentralized network state work very well, where there's like a lot of things happening on the local level or regional level, different policies with different state agencies and institutions, not just a one kind of meaty type. So institutionally, actually, what we're seeing is that you can get conditionality on a very, very diverse range of institutions. I think, coalitional politics seems to be a very, very, very key indicator here. What we're finding is that in almost all of the cases, in order for states to implement industrial policies that include conditionality, that include guardrails, they had to form coalitions, right? And these coalitions, political coalitions, could take different shapes. It could be a dyad where the state is forming relationships with business, whether it's business organizations or firms, and kind of creating, structures, institutions, again, for collaboration, for dialogue, and negotiation between them. But we've also seen even more broad coalitions where the state is actually in dialogue both with business and corporations, but also with labor and public organizations, where these very broad organizations and coalitional structures, again, help negotiate the terms, right? So they help say, okay, what are the things that you guys need? What does business want? Here are what our conditions on, and there's a kind of negotiation with what firms can live with, what the government's priorities are. And we've seen these kind of coalitions work both on a ad hoc fashion. So it could be, again, going back to the Obama auto bailout period, is where they kind of had a ad hoc coalition of car manufacturers with labor, or with labor signing off on agreements that they might have not wanted to live on if it was with not through this kind of coalitional support. But we also seen much more historical kind of longevity of these coalitions that kind of sustain much longer, right? State and business working and developing a long-time relationship, and then you can get these kind of 10-year agreements that are broaden the investment. And then finally, on kind of the ideational angle, this is something that we're still working on, but at least there's a few examples where it looks like the ideational aspect of kind of industrial policy sometimes survives even through administrations, even through coalition fracturing, and even through ideational remodeling. The best example here would be Korea, and here I'm building on Liz Thurbon's work, her book on developmental mindset, where she shows that key state elites that were kind of committed to these ideas of developmentalism survived through different institutional formations, again, different coalitions, and kind of brought these. So there's something about this kind of a core ideational, but this is something that we're still kind of working through. Where does the ideational foundation work? And then to wrap up this finding, we're also kind of want to highlight the impact of what we see right now as intervening variables, things that could increase the likelihood of success for conditionality And here we're finding through these case studies.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah,
Can I interrupt you with a question? Because I actually want to ask about the conditions under which conditionality is good. So you talk about corporate welfare. It's like, what if so one of the things we were talking about before, you could think back to Gordon Hanson's paper this morning about where sometimes you just want uptake. So like, I'm all for not giving rich people more money than they have already. But so there's enforceability, but also like, so when he talks about the SBA or depressed areas, where actually what you want is just uptake, and is there a trade-off between, the conditions of conditionality, like, so there's frictions around conditionality, and other sorts of related things. Like, is it always a good thing? Yes.
Yeah, and is this joining this question? 5 minutes left. 5 minutes. Okay, no, I'm reaching the end. That's a great question. I think, and my colleagues from Europe, I mean, we've had this, my co-authors, we have this debate, and when they were saying, the EU for the last couple of years, they've been throwing up massive amounts of money, and there's some regions or countries that haven't been even, their problem is to spend that money, right? They're having all these grants from the EU, and they're not being able to find. So I guess it's a non-starter, right? You have to have some kind of, and then your concern, I assume, would say that, too much conditionality would scare them off, they'll go somewhere else, right? Here I would be, I would...
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, this is a good question. I don't think I have a quick kind of response. I think this is something to think about. My initial kind of response to that is that that states need to figure out a way to to have some conditionality, because if you're just going to be giving off, if it's just going to be the kind of Amazon, take money, come here, do what we want, it's not going to, the results are not going to be the intended results. So, okay, you need to find some kind of configuration where you are able to get what you want, and it's a challenge, but yeah, I take your point. Yeah, let's go.
I'll let them go.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah. Chase.
Well, I'm sorry if we're derailing you here, but I guess, so, I'm thinking, of course, about investment subsidies and conditionalities. And, you could argue that almost all of them are conditional in some way, right? To get the rebate for the manufacturing investment, you have to actually show proof that you purchased the new manufacturing equipment.
Yeah.
So is that, am I thinking about this too broadly? Is that a conditionality? And in which case, is it really the presence of a conditionality? Because normally they are doing something.
Yes,
like creating a job or spending money, right? So that's not what you mean. You mean something beyond that. And so how do we delimit conditionality and distinguish more fundamentally about?
So we have this, I haven't presented it here, but we have this in the paper, I think, or it's supposed to be in the paper in the next draft, where we're kind of distinguishing between the conditions you have to meet to get the subsidies and the money, and then, so that's kind of the, on the kind of T1, but then conditionalities that are future oriented, right? So what you'll need to do with that money, right? So of course the initial ones are easier to enforce, right? So if you don't meet the criteria, you're not going to get our money. But the harder ones to enforce, but that's the ones that are kind of, I guess, more dramatic as far as kind of the outcomes, are the ones that you have to meet later on, right? And that's a challenge both to enforce, because you've already given, but I know some examples here, I can build on my own work, where there's ways that governments have found, so you don't give all the money in the initial stage, right? So even if you're, it could be, if it's R&D grant, then you break them up over time with milestones, right? So there's ways to ensure and to put in conditionalities that kind of also, you're not providing all of the money in the initial stages. But yeah, we are aware to notice that there's a difference between meeting the initial criteria and then meeting future criteria. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to follow.
Keep this quick because we have 1.5 minutes left.
Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on. Sorry, I just wanted to follow up on Josh. I think you should also take into account moments when there is overburdening of conditionality. And venture capitalists that are public complain to me in interviews that they have too many conditions to fulfill, too many boxes to check before they can do any deal. Yeah. And in the end, they don't do any deal, because when they're done doing all the conditionality, then the deal is gone.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I also have interviewed venture capitalists, and they also always complain about this, but I think it's a good sign when they complain about this, because it means that there's something that is keeping them in check. Let me take my minute just to conclude. So I didn't present, I'll just present this quickly, and if you see it's in the paper. We're looking at the economic business cycle, the type of development strategy, right? So historically, we've seen a lot, Andrew's work has shown this and others, where it matters what kind of development model, business model you have, right? The exports are different than ISI and vice versa. So the type of development strategy or industrial policy in this regard, and the geopolitical threats, right? So we've seen this happen now in the US-China moment where states are able to demand more from business when they when they use the geopolitical threats in all sorts of ways. So it's going to just to sum up, the return of industrial policy has emerged and has to work with the social institutional remnants of the neoliberal order, but must also strive to change and adapt them, right? This goes, I think, also to a point made earlier. And then, and what we try to do here is provide analytical building blocks, crafting new social coalitions, state institutions that are conducive to effective IP. So not just showing what does conditionalities look like, but how can we get them? Yeah. That's it? Yeah. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your feedback. And please come to me if you have more suggestions and ideas.
Thank you.